Welcome, everybody, to the EB3.Work channel. I am here with immigration attorney and former consular officer, Tiffney Johnson. Tiffney, welcome.
Thank you.
Tiffney spent a little bit of background, about 15 years as a consular officer working in Central America, Mexico, Australia, Cuba. Tell us a little bit about that experience.
Well, every time you get posted to another country, which is part of the job as a consular officer, um, it's kind of like starting on a new job in a corporate culture, a brand new company every time you move. And so you have to, just the same way you would do in that situation, take time to learn about the culture, um, you know, even, the office culture, the country's culture before you can make informed decisions about anything, including adjudications. And interestingly, as I spent more and more time adjudicating and talking to people every single day through the interview process, I mean, you really do become an expert on the everyday life in that country. And when I would sit on committees outside of the consular section, I really was like, whoa, I have this understanding of, what kind of salaries do people make in this country? What is the education system like? What is the immigration system like? That many other people in the embassy did not have. So that really made every post so interesting that you're in a unique position to really, really learn about the culture because all you do all day is talk to everyday people.
That sounds so interesting.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, and you had a pretty long career as a consular officer. You interviewed o- over 150,000 visa applicants. Is that right?
At least.
Wow. Wow.
At least,
That's
and that's immigrant and non-immigrant visas. I spent many, many years doing exclusively immigrant visas and then transitioned to smaller posts where I did everything. So yes, 150,000.
that's awesome. And you're an immigration attorney now, and we'll get into kind of questions about general questions. I just want to preface for everybody: this is not legal advice. This is just general information. Um, but kind of segueing into that, what are some of the common challenges and mistakes that you saw, and for those watching, we're going to focus on the other worker category, the EB3 unskilled other worker category.
Yeah, I mean, in general, I would say the biggest mistake people make is um, going online and looking for information from non-government sources. I would say that, especially online forums in your local country, Reddit, all those kind of things. It is full of misinformation, and it is not easy to discern what is good information and what is bad information. Um, some of the people posting on those forums haven't even had a visa interview. They're just saying, my cousin said this and that when they went for their interview. So I think that is one of the biggest mistakes people make is just, um, looking at information that is not from official sources and listening to what their attorney tells them and other reliable government sources, U.S. government websites that have, up to date, accurate information as to what is required for your appointment.
That's great. And so, across the different embassies across the world, does the um, is the EB3 interview process pretty much the same, or does it vary from embassy to embassy?
The interview process could basically be the same, but the logistics of what you're going to do when you get there, even the types of civil documents you will bring, whether you need translations, all of that can be very different from country to country. And so it's really important to know the country specific things that you need to bring for your interview.
Excellent. Now, people get nervous initially, just kind of fear of the unknown. I want to do adjustment of status because I'm afraid to go to the consular interview. Um, you know, what would you say to those people first off?
Yeah, well, um, the interesting thing is, although people feel very nervous about the consular process, the truth of the matter is there is much more discretion in the adjustment of status process and whether or not a person is going to be approved than there is in the consular process. There's many more factors that come into play as to whether someone qualifies to adjust their status. And also, you're not necessarily excluded from interview just because you're adjusting status. And in fact, I would expect that under the new administration that we will probably see a return to more interviews, as we've already seen even in the embassies, categories that were waived interviews during the pandemic have not that has now been eliminated. So I think it is totally possible that we'll see a trend back towards more adjustment of status people being interviewed. But additionally, in the consular process, there is very little discretion actually in issuing an immigrant visa. If you qualify, then unless you have a statutory ineligibility, the officer has to approve your case. They can't just, um, I don't like you, I'm not going to approve your case. Uh, they have to have a very, very, very solid reason, statutory reason, not to approve your case. And with adjustment of status, there is always an element of discretion involved. And so that should put you at ease with the consular process that unless you have a statutory ineligibility, your case has to be approved.
Yeah, that's I'm glad you brought that up because the concept of discretion, I think not, the layperson doesn't really understand that, especially the difference in the officer's ability to use discretion for a non-immigrant visa versus their
That's right.
inability to use it. So talking about that for a minute and,
Yes. Well, with a non-immigrant visa, there's a lot more subjectivity, especially when you're talking in the category of a tourist visa. In fact, I would say 95% of the decisions that consular officer makes on tourist visas are totally discretionary, meaning it is 100% the officer's decision whether they believe what the person is saying about their purpose of travel, their situation, their financial situation, all the factors that go into determining whether someone's eligible for a tourist visa. So it's very subjective, and the officer is, for better words, the decider. They decide if a person gets it and a person doesn't get it. And if the officer decides they don't think the person is likely to use the visa in the way that it's intended to be used, then the officer can decide. They don't need to ask anyone, they don't need to check with anyone. That's discretionary. Whereas with an immigrant visa, an officer in the interview is basically just ensuring that everything you represented in your application is indeed true. You didn't commit any kind of fraud. In other words, misrepresenting potentially if, say, some jobs experience is required for that job, right? And so they want to make sure if you were supposed to have 2 years of experience for this job, you actually have 2 years of experience. Because the officer is the person who is the expert on documents in that country, not USCIS, who makes the initial decision on the petition. So that is really what they're looking for. So as long as everything was accurately represented in that application, there should be no surprises at the immigrant visa interview.
perfect. Yeah, I'm glad you covered that because, one of the common questions we get is, "Oh, my F1 was denied or my B2 was denied twice.
Right.
Is that gonna affect my EB3 process?" And
Right.
so
And that has absolutely no bearing on a person's eligibility for EB3, as long as when they applied for the tourist visa or the student visa, there wasn't any kind of fraud. involved in those applications. That is really the kind of uh the only situation where a prior refusal might come into play for an employment-based visa. And I don't mean the type of fraud where someone might say, "Oh, I'm visiting my, friend," when really they're visiting their grandma. That's not what I'm talking about. I mean like actual document fraud, something very serious. But barring that, there really is no bearing on the fact that you got a denied a student visa or tourist visa in the past.
Okay. Okay. Fantastic. Yeah. You worked a lot on fraud prevention in the past. So yeah, thank you for covering that. So what the employer files the perm, the employer files the I-140. What role does the employer have in the consular process?
Well well, firstly, I would say the the more, robust the I-140 petition packet is, that information, see, is already going to be available to the consular officer. Everything that was submitted with that I-140 is gonna be there for the consular officer to see. Now, sometimes a really long time has passed between the time the I-140 is filed and the time someone is being interviewed. So the employer can provide things like proof that the company is still able to pay. The company still has that level of earnings, that the company, they can make sure the employee knows exactly what they're going to be doing in the job, what they're going to be paid, and that this information is made available to the employee and that the employee knows all this before the interview and that again, no surprises. There shouldn't be the employee should know what is in that I-140 packet because they're the ones going to be sitting in front of the window being asked questions. The employer's not there to answer questions. So the employee might, you might want to know basic things about the company like how long it's been in business. These kind of things, it's possible the officer may ask these kinds of questions. How many employees work there? Um, they want to know the size of the business. It's not marginal, that kind of thing.
Right. Right. Fantastic. And we've talked about this in the past. Um, when which I thought was really interesting, and I appreciated you sharing it with me. When the applicant first walks in the room, and the consular officer is kind of typing at the
Mhm.
computer, and what probably feels like a very long time for the applicants. Tell us a little bit about what's happening. And
Well, unlike some applicants may have had the experience of going for a tourist visa, and it's a very short interview where they're just taught. Mostly, the officer's just talking. The officer may not even look at any document you brought in a tourist visa interview. An immigrant visa interview is very different. The officer is required to do a lot of different kinds of checks on which are in the system, and they're looking at your petition, which is now a lot of it is electronic. So the officer may not have a paper file even, and they may be looking at everything on the computer, which is basically just what your employer submitted. They also are looking at the results of your fingerprints, which you give your fingerprints when you go for these interviews. Those results come back almost instantaneously. So they're looking at those kind of things, your fingerprints, there's all kinds of other security checks that they're doing. And sometimes they're doing them right when you're coming up to the window, especially a really efficient officer is multitasking and doing those things all at one time. So don't be concerned that they're looking at something negative just because they're looking at the computer. They're just doing their job and they may be completely referencing your file just on their computer.
perfect,
Mhm.
perfect, excellent. Well, I don't want to take too much of your time. We're hitting about the 14-minute mark right now. um, anything else that you'd like to kind of add?
Well, the applicant really needs to go into this interview at ease. They really don't have anything to worry about in these situations with the EB3 interviews. Um, the the what was I going to say? Um, they should have confidence that uh, there's not going to be any trick questions, really. If there's really something they don't know that they're asked, they can simply say, I don't know. They don't have to have an answer for every question. It's not their They can't expect to have an answer for every question an officer may ask. They should also know that overseas consular officers actually do not see a huge volume of employment-based visas. So the officer may ask questions that are not relevant to your case, and that's okay. That may happen. For example, if they ask for what's called an affidavit of support, you're not going to have one of those. And that officer may have never seen your kind of case before and may ask for something. And you can say, well, I don't have that. And that's okay. These things can always be ironed out after an interview, even if an officer says, I can't approve your case today or whatever. These things can be ironed out because these are just paperwork problems. They're not a problem with you, and they can be resolved. And that's what your attorney is there to do.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. The affidavit of support, we've seen that before. And for those that are watching that don't know, in usually a family-based case, let's say a marriage-based
Right.
immigration case, the U.S. citizen is required to submit an affidavit of support to show that
Right.
they can. But in an employment-based case, that's usually taken care of during the I-140 stage with the ability to pay.
Yes, in lieu of the affidavit of support, actually the requirement on the EB3 is that they have a current offer letter from the employer. That is what serves the same purpose, saying you have a job that will support you when you get to the United States. So it serves the same purpose.
Right. Perfect.
Mhm.
Great. This has been fantastic. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I want to let everybody know, if it's okay with you, that you're available for consultations
Yes.
For both non-immigrants as well as immigrants.
Yes. Employment-based and family-based immigrant visas as well.
Fantastic. And I'll put that info
Okay.
in the links. So thank you very much, and hope to have you again.
Yes. Thank you very much.